Today. Moderating tonight, we have Rosie Perez. Perez is an Oscar, Golden Globe, and an Emmy-nominated actress and choreographer. Perez has been a cultural mainstay since her first breakout performances in To the Right Thing, White Men Can't Jump, and Fearless. Perez is a proud Puerto Rican, born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. She's the author of The Handbook for an Unpredictable Life. She's also a long-term boxing fan who can be found ringside. It's how she earned the nickname, the First Lady of Boxing. And the other guest of honor tonight, Dave Wedge. In Boston, among his books are Boston Strong, which was adapted for the 2017 movie Patriots Day, Ice Bucket Challenge. Well, the inside story of Tom Brady's fight for redemption, Hunting Whitey, and The Last Days of John Lennon. It's 2022 bestseller, Writing the Devil is in development as a feature film. His next book, Love and Hate, which we are here to celebrate today, is in development as a feature film with Academy Award-winning action producer Sam Rockwell. He's currently working on Top Town, a true crime thriller about the sensational Karen Lee murder case in Canton, Massachusetts. It seems like Rosie is up, so we can talk about that a little bit as I get on this stage to my guest.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Powerhouse. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I see a lot of friends here. Thank you all for coming out. Whether it's my New York friends with transplants, to see Brockton guy over here, Brockton Boxing Club, love it. Want to recognize a few gentlemen that are here tonight. First of all, we have middleweight world champion Vito Antuofermo. We have middleweight champion Iran Barkley. So, Rosie, this is awesome. Thank you for being here. Let's go.
Let's go. All right. First of all, I am so excited because outside of Ali, Marvin Hagler is hands down my favorite fighter, always has been. And I had the opportunity of meeting him at the International Boxing Hall of Fame when I had the honor of becoming the Grand Marshal. That's where I met this gentleman, Iran Barkley, there. And he didn't disappoint. He was so gracious, he was so funny, he was so kind. He invited me and my cousin Sixto to sit with him on the bus, and he hung out with us, and just was a wonderful man. And I turned into like a little girl around him. I talked a lot, and I barely said a few words because I was in such awe of him. And when Sam Rockwell called me and said, I got the rights to this book, I wanted to pick your brain about it. And I said, pick my brain about it? Oh my God, do you have several hours? Are you kidding me? And he said, oh, it was really? And I said, yeah, whatever. And he calls me back with his producing partner, and he said, you know what? Let's work together on it. And I said, are you kidding me? He says, you're gonna be a producer on it, let's go. And I was so honored, I was so excited. And I was a fan of Boston Strong. And so when they told me it was Dave Wedge, I was like, oh my God, this is gonna be spectacular. This is gonna be a great thing. And when I started reading the book, I was blown away because I thought I knew everything about Marvin Hagler, and I didn't know anything about Marvin Hagler outside of the ringside commentary, and this book is really about his origins, about him growing up and who he became. And he was such a mysterious, secret man on that level. And so this book is, someone said it reads like a thriller, and it does. It's really fantastic. And it's not just for boxing fans. This is for just the general public because it's just so rich, and about the boxing corruption, about, you know, different fighters and their backstory. It's just fantastic about racial tensions in America and overseas. It's just an amazing book. And my first question to you is, why? Why did you pick this book? Why did you pick this subject?
Well, thank you. You explained a lot of how I feel about the story. So I grew up in Brockton, where, you know, Marvin was raised, and I always grew up with that, you know, under that legacy of Rocky Marciano and Marvin Hagler, you know, the City of Champions, two great fighters, great champions. And I thought I knew everything about Marvin Hagler. When Marvin was alive, I actually wanted to write the book with him. And I actually approached him at one point, we talked about it, but he just wasn't ready to do it. And then sadly, he passed away pretty young in 2021. And at that point, I had just finished my last book, Riding with Eagle, about some bikers and crazy stuff in out Long Island. Yeah, it was nuts. And I just finished that book, and I was like, you know what, it's time to do this. Marvin had just passed away, and I thought to myself, his legacy has never been secure. His legacy in the public's eye is, oh, that's the guy that was awesome, and then he lost the Sugar Ray Leonard, and we never saw him again. But that's not Marvin Hagler's legacy, and that's not who he is, and that's not his spirit. This book is his spirit. It's what you said. It's his origin story. And there was so much I didn't know that I thought I knew. You know, I knew he was born in Newark, but I didn't know he lived there until he was 15 years old. And I did not know his family story of escaping Newark during the riots in 1967. Some of the worst riots the country had ever seen. 26 people were killed in a weekend. You know, it makes these riots that go on today look like kindergarten, you know. Cops shooting people in the streets and people living under martial law. Literally, Marvin and his family were hiding in their house.
I would love to read a part of the book with that, because this is what really struck me.
Rosie, Perez is going to read some of my book. I'm okay with this. Just so everyone knows, I'm okay with this.
For several days, Ida Mae, that's his mother, and the kids laid on the floor, sleeping side by side, and only moving around the apartment on all fours. They were prisoners in their own home as cops patrolled the streets outside, firing at random and often getting into gun battles with rooftop snipers and other civilians joining in the uprising. Ida Mae and the kids stayed out of the line of fire, sliding across the floor on couch cushions to get to the bathroom and the kitchen. Quote, "It was like the end of the world," Veronica remembers. "Mom, we need to get out of here," Robin told her. When I read that, just the visual of them having to live on all floors for days on end, you know, and it was Marvin, because Marvin had to be the man of the house. He grew up basically without a father, you know, and it was just startling. I had no idea.
No, I didn't either. And you know, like I said, I knew he was from Newark, but that story hasn't been told very widely. Like hardcore boxing fans and people that are really invested in this stuff know some of it. But what I found from interviewing his family, Veronica's his sister. I interviewed Veronica, I interviewed Bertha, his first wife, and some other family members. And the stuff they told me is just, it's incredible. It's all in the book. And it just tells the story of a family that was really desperate. And they were, you know, she had two sons. She had Marvin and she had Robbie, who also went on to fight. He was a great middleweight fighter as well, fought for the world championship. And she was afraid that her two sons were going to get killed because, you know, we talk about George Floyd and that stuff, but back then it was George Floyd times 10. You know, there was a lot of black men being killed in the streets of Newark, and I get into the racial history of Newark. And
The
that story,
Italians
the Italians versus the blacks, and it was a very difficult time in that city, in this country. And Ida Mae, in her infinite wisdom, said, you know what, we're going to uproot. She happened to have a relative up in Brockton, and she moved the family up there. And Marvin was 15 years old, and there was no father in the house, and he knew nobody in Brockton. He had never been there in his life. And all of a sudden, this 15-year-old kid that just escaped the war zone is dropped in Brockton.
Right, and he had to go to work. He had to go to work. And I'm just going to jump ahead. When he was in Newark, his uncles, he idolized, and they taught him about staying fit and diet and exercise, so he was always in great shape. That said, he ends up getting into a fight with Donnell Wigfall.
Yeah, this was kind of his his moment where Marvin figured out who he was going to be. When he got to Brockton, he had no clue what he was going to do. As he said, he had dropped out of school back when he was in Newark. He never went to school in Brockton. He went to work as a laborer, just lugging bricks and wheelbarrows. And he was at a party one night in the projects in Brockton, and he ran into the wrong guy, and he hit on the wrong girl. And his name was Dornell Wigfall. He was a big, tough kid. He was actually a football player. The Patriots were actually scouting him. And Dornell was also a boxer, an amateur boxer. And he fought out of a gym right across the street from the projects. It was run by mobsters. He was a tough kid. And Marvin got his ass kicked. He broke a tooth, and he had a bruised jaw. Thought he broke his jaw. The next day, he said, "I'm never letting that happen again." So he actually went to the gym run by the mobsters, and he was ignored. And you probably remember Vinny Vecchione. Nobody. But Vinny Vecchione ran the gym, and he ended up being a trainer. He trained some fighters over the years, but they ignored him. So Marvin went like 3 or 4 days, and no one ever talked to him, and he got frustrated. So he heard there was another gym across town, and that was the Petronelli Brothers gym. He went in there, and when he went in there, that's when he met Goody and Pat Petronelli.
Now, Goody and Pat Petronelli, Goody specifically they were best friends with Rocky Marciano, and they were going to go into business with the gym together and let everyone know what happened.
So that's another thing I didn't know. Again, growing up in Brockton, everyone has a story about Rocky or Marvin, and like my dad was Rocky Marciano's paper boy. I caddied for Marvin at a golf tournament once. So what I didn't know was the sequence of events that happened with Rocky's life and Marvin's life. 1969, Rocky's long retired. He was traveling the country. He was doing variety shows. He was doing TV shows. He was doing public speaking, all that sort of stuff. And Goody and Pat said, "Let's open a gym together." And they were going to do it. And then he dies in a plane crash, 1969, August. That same summer, Marvin Hagler's family had moved to Brockton. So Goody and Pat after Rocky passed away, were wondering, what are we going to do? They had a construction company, but Rocky was their ticket to get into boxing, and their ticket to open the door to that boxing world. So if they had a good fighter, they could get a fight because of the reputation of Rocky. Once he was gone, they had no idea what to do, and then in walks Marvin Hagler. And obviously they didn't know who Marvin was or what he was going to be, but it didn't take long before they realized he was pretty special.
And the dynamic that struck me was they're Italian Americans. They just experienced a tragic loss. They were at a loss. They couldn't figure out who they were going to be, as you stated. And Marvin, an African American man, is at a loss too, and trying to find his identity as well. And here he is running from Italian Americans who want to kill all the black people in Newark. And he goes to Brockton, and he walks into this Italian American gym, and they didn't deal with the mob, right? Correct?
The Petronellis didn't. I mean, in that era, if you were Italian and you were in boxing, you were probably approached by them at some point. There's very few fighters that weren't. But Goody and Pat, Rocky talked about it throughout his career.
Yeah.
Goody and Pat, they had no reason to have any involvement with the mob because they had no fighters that could make any money. But once Marvin came along, that changed, and that's also later in the book. But you make a good point, that in Newark, there was a big racial division between the Italians and the blacks, and a lot of the police officers were Italian, and it became an 80% black community, like in a matter of a couple of years. When Marvin moved to Brockton, it was a much more racially mixed community. It was much more, almost half and half, but he still had that inherent distrust of Italians and whites, and he didn't know how to deal with that. It took a long time before Goody and Pat earned his trust. And it also took a long time before Goody and Pat saw what Marvin could do. But once they all trusted each other, they built what they eventually called the triangle. And it was a pretty beautiful thing that they did. They went through the boxing world together.
Yeah, and it's very rare in the boxing world where a fighter stays with its corner all throughout their career. And it's really amazing. And you state in the book that it did take Marvin a long time to trust them, and you told me a story about them paying for Marvin's lunch. Can you tell that?
Yeah. So, Marvin being a poor kid from Newark, no dad, no family, no money, when he first started boxing with them, he also started working for their construction company, and they were paying them $3 or $4 an hour or something, and when they would go to lunch, Goody and Pat would try to pay for lunch for him, and Marvin would say, no, I don't want you paying for me. He said, Marvin, you're working for us, we're buying your lunch, it's okay. And he would always say no, because he was afraid that if he let them buy him lunch, that they would want something from him in return. So someday later in life, if he became wealthy or successful, he was afraid of, well, we bought you lunch, now you owe us, time to pay us back. But he learned that they weren't those kind of guys, that they were just supporting him at a time when he needed support. And the loyalty that they built in those early years, which is the subject of this book, was really crucial to Marvin's success.
So let's go into that, because here they are, they trained Marvin, they built him up to become a really good fighter, and he couldn't get fights. They shut him out, and it was because of the corruption in boxing.
Yeah, no, and so they were all outsiders. That's the thing. Marvin was not known. Goody and Pat were not known. And in 1976, the Olympics happened, and Sugar Ray Leonard, Leon Spinks won the gold medal, and Rocky came out, movie Rocky. So the country was very excited about boxing. So Don King, being the entrepreneur that he is, launched this thing called the Tournament of Champions. And it was on ABC, and the Ring magazine was a partner in it. And no shock to probably most here that it turned out to be crooked and rigged. Everybody that was involved, all the guys that were in those fights were either Don King fighters or people that paid to be in it. And Don approached Marvin to be in it, said, you can fight in this tournament, but you got to come work with me. And Marvin said no. He wouldn't say no to the he wouldn't get rid of the Petronelli brothers. So he was blackballed from it. It ended up spiraling out of control into a big investigation, and the thing got shut down. There was all sorts of scandals involved with it. But it really, by that time Marvin had 40 pro fights. He couldn't get a title shot. He was clearly the number one contender.
Yeah. So let's talk about how he got that title shot. Funny enough, this also blew my mind. The late U.S. House Speaker Thomas Tip O'Neill and late U.S. Senator Ted Kennedy, they were fans of Marvin Hagler. And they kept asking themselves, why the hell is he not getting a fight? And
yeah, they actually threatened a congressional investigation into the boxing game because of this ABC scandal that happened with Don King. And they ended up going to Bob Arum, and they said, Bob, you're going to give our constituents, they both represent Massachusetts, and Ted Kennedy and Marvin actually knew each other. Marvin would do things politically, show up at fundraisers for Senator Kennedy. And Kennedy and Kennedy and O'Neill both went to Bob Arum and said, give our guy a shot, or we're going to launch an investigation. And I interviewed Bob Arum for the book, and he recalls it vividly. 95 years old now, but he remembers it like it was yesterday. And he said, I don't need my ass in Congress. He said that this is not going to happen. So he ended up eventually getting that shot. But that's what it took the threat of congressional investigation.
and he got the shot against.
He got the shot against that gentleman right there.
Right there, Vito.
So Vito was the middleweight champ of the world, and Marvin fought him in that first fight, and it was a draw, I believe, right? No, yeah. But you were the champ.
You were the champ.
Yeah, and it was a draw, right?
Right.
Yeah, draw. Vito retained the title, and then don't punch me. I think I have this right. But there's a great scene at the end of the book with Vito. We got to tell it too during the line. So Marvin was, promised a rematch, and he wasn't given it. Instead, it was given to Alan Minter, who Vito fought.
Right.
He was the number one contender, Minter, right?
Right, versus Marvin.
Right.
They supposed to use long-term defense as he did. And that was stupid, they had 2 huge judges. I'm sorry, I was about to say. They were 2 huge judges.
Can you give him the mic?
One of the judges One, he had this thing.
Matter of fact, my English judge gave me only 1 round out of 15. He went that knocked down. That's how I was my title.
Thank you very much.
So if you want to know that story, it's in the book, I write about the fight you had with Alan Minter, the terrible decision. It was widely called a crooked decision. I think, I have a passage in the book where I believe the judge you're talking about that scored the fight so lopsided was actually in Minter's entourage on the plane that went to the fight.
Yeah, so let's talk about Alan Minter. So, Hagler eventually gets his chance to fight Minter, and he has to go overseas.
So unfortunately, this gentleman lost to Alan Minter, however you want to slice it. And Alan Minter's now the champion. Marvin had a couple more tune-up fights, and then he finally gets his title shot, and it's against Alan Minter. And Alan Minter was backed by a group called the National Front. It was a white power organization in London, England at the time. It was actually based in the hometown where he grew up in Crawley, England. And they were, at the time in London, there was a massive campaign with these folks. There was a lot of riots that went on. There was some fire bombings. They were hanging up posters, racist posters and things like that. So that's kind of the backdrop of this fight. Alan Minter kind of tried to distance himself from the group, but he really didn't. And he actually had a press conference with the National Front before the fight, and he made a horrible comment where he said, "No black man will ever take my title." And suffice to say that, you know, if it happened today, the word viral would begin to describe it, but it was global headlines, and that was the setting for that fight at Wembley Arena.
And he tried to rationalize it by saying, well, Marvin made a racist comment saying he won't shake a white man's hand, and he actually never said that.
That's right. Yeah, no, he didn't say that. And Kevin Finnegan actually came out and said Marvin never said that. What Marvin said was, "I don't shake my opponent's hands before a fight."
Right. And here's the crazy part about it, why I'm so happy to read this legend here. He told me he hated Marvin and Marvin hated him in their first fight. You know, and then fight again. He shows up at
He showed up at the Minter fight and
in support of Marvin.
in support of Marvin. Well, he had just lost to Minter too, so. But no, so they have the fight. You won't get into the fight.
Yeah.
Okay. So they fight at Wembley Arena, and there's this racial backdrop, and amazingly, there was a soccer game before, and all these hooligans, the National Front people, drinking all day long. It's a night fight, 10, 11 o'clock at night. They were actually selling cases of beer at the fight, cases of glass bottle beer. They no longer do that in England because of this fight. But what happened was people were very drunk. Marvin goes out, he kicked the living shit out of Alan Minter. They stop the fight in the 3rd round, and Marvin wins. And as Marvin does this, puts his hands in the air, bottles start raining down from the top, and all the drunk hooligans chanting Minter's name, they just started tossing bottles, and it erupted into a full-scale riot. Marvin got covered literally by the Petronelli brothers. There's a great picture in the book of it, and they were hustled out of the arena by the bobbies, the cops, and the rioting continued outside. I interviewed Marvin's family. I don't want to give away the whole book, but this is like the audiobook version. But they get into the limo, and all these rioters smash the windows of Marvin Hagler's limo, and they run up. Marvin never got his belt that night. He never got it. He had to have it mailed back to him in Brockton three weeks later.
Yeah. But because of that fight, Marvin became a star. He became a star, and he became very instrumental of what HBO boxing really became. And then he went on to have a fantastic career.
Well, the other thing I want to just back up for a second, Rosie, like the reason why I focus on the Minter fight and I tell the story is because Marvin wasn't the kind of guy that talked about it. But when this happened, Marvin didn't go out there and have a press conference and talk about how he was horrified and all that. He made a few comments about what happened, and his family did, but he didn't really dwell on it. He was all business. He moved on, went to the next fight. But I think, and when I researched this book and his life, that is the seminal moment for him. And I call him the unlikely civil rights hero because he wasn't, Muhammad Ali or Bill Russell or an activist. He wasn't that at all. But he did it through his actions in that fight. And he literally fought racism that night. He won. And the way he carried himself with dignity afterwards and just went on about his business, to me, that's kind of the legacy of Marvin Hagler, who he was.
Even in the in his locker room after the fight, when they were interviewing him, Marvin was so gracious towards Minter, and just wouldn't really address, as you stated, in length about what happened. And they actually called that the night of shame.
They did, yeah.
For boxing, and it's an infamous event, and if you ever want to look at it on YouTube, you're gonna go, holy shit. And, you hear Howard Cosell go, throwing bottles in the air, and,
Oh, we forgot the best part of the story. So as the bottles are raining down, Howard Cosell and Bob Arum jump under the ring, and they're hiding, and all the writers are covering their heads with their typewriters, and this guy right here is running out with some of the writers and some of the members of the family. Someone smashes a bottle on his head, and he turns around and knocks the guy out. and there's a great book, the great George Kimball, Boston Herald writer, my friend back there, Kerry Byrne remembers George Kimball. Great boxing writer, legendary, no longer with us, but he wrote a great book called The Four Kings, and he recounts that sequence in that. And in George's words, he said, it was the best punch that Vito ever threw.
Marvin.